You're yelling at them and it looks like they're ignoring you. Honestly, they're struggling to hear the words that you're saying when you're yelling because they're in fight or flight.
Wow.
Everything that comes out of our mouths either strengthens the connection with our child or weakens the connection with our child. We have to learn how to regulate our own emotions so that we can help our child co-regulate theirs.
Welcome back to the OpenEd podcast. I'm your sometimes host, Ella, and today, as I mentioned before, I'm joined by Dr. Amy Moore. So I'm just going to jump straight into it. What led you to education? Why did you decide that this was the path that you were going to go down?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't get asked that very often. I usually get asked, what made you become a psychologist? So my undergraduate degree is in psychology, and I graduated and I wasn't really sure where I was going to go to grad school. And so I took a job as a teacher's assistant at a private school, a preschool program, and I fell in love with working with kids. And as I was trying to figure out, okay, where am I going to go to grad school, I went to University of South Carolina, and they launched a brand new program, a master's program in education. And I said, you know what? I love this so much. I'm going to do that instead. So I went and got my master's in early childhood education. And then I spent 10 years as a child development specialist working for Air Force child development and youth programs. And so I did spend some time in the classroom as a teacher as well. But I started because I worked with so many children and families, especially who were struggling with a neurodivergent diagnosis. And I started saying, we're missing something in the classroom. This curriculum is all great, but we're missing something. And so I decided to go back to school, get my PhD in psychology so that I could really learn more about the brain and how the brain learns, and find out, okay, what do we need to bring back to the classroom, whether it's a homeschooling classroom, traditional classroom, early childhood classroom, to help these struggling kids. And so that's the space that I sit in now, right? I kind of straddle the psychology and education space because that's where my passion lies.
That's really beautiful. I'm curious, why were you so interested in understanding the underlying why, right? I love the fact that you have this background in teaching, because I think it adds another layer to it, right? It's not just that you learned about education, it's that you got to experience what normal teachers experience day to day, the struggle trying to teach kids that are not being receptive necessarily to the information. But you didn't take the easy road out. You didn't label these kids as, troubled kids, or you didn't say that, okay, there's something wrong here. Let's just diagnose, or let's just move on. It was like, I really want to get curious about how I can help families, how we can solve these underlying issues and make this a lot better. Why do you think that was your initial reaction?
So I was a struggling student, right? So I was smart, so I did well, but I spent more time in the hallway than in the classroom in middle school because I talked too much, or I was constantly distracted, or I was distracting the class. And I was diagnosed with ADHD in college. And that was after I had failed out of college twice.
Wow.
And not because I couldn't do the work, but because I wouldn't go to class, or I would sleep through class, or I didn't like something, or it was too hard, so I didn't go. And so my mom, who was also a child development specialist, said, I think you have ADHD, right? And this is in the 80s where really hyperactive boys were the ones being diagnosed. But she saw the symptoms. And so I went and was assessed and was off the charts, ADHD. And so I was medicated, and then I did really well through college and grad school, and got my life back on track. But as I was working with children and families, I thought, we can't miss these things. We have to be able to identify this early so that these kids don't have to struggle so much. And I was really drawn to the struggling kids. I was drawn to those children with ADHD who everyone else was frustrated with, but I got it. I understood how their brains were struggling. And so I wanted to help. The problem is I just didn't have enough tools in the toolbox
Mm.
to help because at the time, medication was the only thing we were doing for ADHD. And I thought, these kids are spending 8 to 10 hours with us every day. We have to be able to do more.
That is wild and makes so much sense, actually, that it was more so your experience. Like, you had this personal understanding of what it was like to be that kid,
Mhm.
and to finally find a tool that worked for you, that helped you get through college, that helped you succeed. Like, that changed so much, I bet. And then to then look at these kids and say, okay, well, let me help you find more tools. I love that. So if we were to dive into that a little bit more, right? What is the common experience of most families with ADHD? Something that I've heard a lot is, you're struggling in some way, shape, or form. Either your kid's not being very receptive to the information, and there's also two elements of this, right? So most of our audience is homeschool families, and so they're not necessarily having the teacher report to them, "Hey, your kid's not paying attention, and this is an issue." They're the ones that are experiencing it themselves, and that can obviously be kind of frustrating as a parent. But most parents are very interested in helping to solve that problem, or helping to help their kids succeed, because most kids do want to succeed. And so what is step one for you? Like, whenever you're chatting with families, whenever you look at these things that are going on, what is step one? And then how do you help people find the right tool for them? Because I bet, like, the hardest part is now there are so many tools, right? And there are so many different things that you could test. It's a game in patience as well, because you can't necessarily figure it all out right at once, right?
Right. So, do you want to know the conversation that happens before a child has an official diagnosis when a parent says, "Hey, I'm concerned that my child has ADHD,"
Yes.
or do you want to know what my advice is after they have a formal diagnosis?
So I would love to know that, like, that first conversation, like, okay, I don't know necessarily if my kid has ADHD, if there's anything, anything that I should be looking into. And then afterwards, once you have an official diagnosis, I think that's where we're going to take the conversation next, is like, okay, how do you figure out what is the right tool? How do you learn more? Where do you go? What are the best resources, kind of a thing?
Yeah. So, first of all, we have this tendency to put my kid can't focus or my kid can't pay attention. We have this tendency to make everything we're seeing about a struggling child, my kid can't focus. And the reality is, our brain shifts attention 4 times a second. So, what we're doing is our brain is focusing on a task, then scanning our environment. We could argue that our
Mm,
brains are designed that way for survival, right?
mm-hmm,
Okay, I'm working on this thing, but I have to make sure there's not a tiger in the bush behind me, right? So I'm scanning
mm-hmm,
my environment, coming back to the task, scanning my environment, coming back to the task. And so it's happening, at light speed, right? You're not seeing it, but that's a normal brain, right? That's the normal function. The problem with an ADHD brain is that we can't tell the difference between a minor inconvenience and a crisis. And so everything is important to the ADHD brain. And so the ADHD brain is also super curious. So it's very easy for the ADHD brain to get pulled into whatever's happening in the environment that pulls us away from the task, just in that natural process. But there are other reasons why our child might be losing focus. And so the first question I say to parents is, look at it through this lens. Is my child tired, hungry, sick, or stressed?
mm,
That is the very first thing that we look for as parents. Is my child tired, hungry, sick, or stressed? Because that will make them lose focus.
mm.
So that's the first thing we're going to look for. So let's say I don't think my child is tired, hungry, or sick. Let's talk about stress. What is it that might be causing stress? So a child can be pulled off task because the task is too hard or because they don't have the skill to do the task. And that causes stress and frustration. And what happens when we're stressed or frustrated is The emotion center of our brain, our amygdala, sets off an alarm and says, danger, right? This is a crisis. You're frustrated. You're stressed. And so then that amygdala hijacks our prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for reasoning and thinking and planning and execution. And then we can't think or learn. So a lot of times what we're seeing is my child can't focus. Well, it's because they're tired, hungry, sick, or stressed, and they don't have the skills, and that's the reason they're stressed. Um, we can look at things like motivation. We can look at things like defiance. But the reality is, what we think is defiance is typically not, right? I'm not going to do this
Interesting.
task. It isn't because I'm being defiant. It's because it's too hard and I'm frustrated and I don't know how to communicate that to you. So,
Interesting.
yeah.
Are there ways to give your kids a little bit more ability to communicate, or like what is the solve there? So like we think they're being defiant. We think that they're, just trying to be difficult with us, or like, they can't focus and this is a problem to solve. First question is, are there tools that we can give them early on to help like talk through or explain or like not be as defiant? Because I would imagine that that is partially an emotional response, right?
It's probably 99% an
Okay.
emotional response. Yeah. Yeah. So there are several things we can do. And first, we have to get curious and we have to be flexible, right? We have to put on our detective hat and say, I wonder what's happening here. And then this is a great opportunity for us to teach our kids problem solving skills.
Hmm.
And by involving them in a problem solving process, we're giving them an element of power and control. And that builds relational equity, right? Hey, my mom or dad is asking me for my opinion, is asking me to participate in problem solving with them, right? And so that makes me feel powerful and in control. So, typically as a parent who is faced with a child who looks like they're being defiant, we start yelling or
Hmm.
imposing consequences,
Hmm.
right? Well, yelling sets off that alarm bell in the brain. And I'm going to come back to your question, but something very interesting happens when we yell at our kids. Um, that alarm goes off. They go into fight, flight, or freeze. The ears can't process language in fight or flight. It's
Mm,
called auditory exclusion. And so, again, intelligently designed to only be able to hear low frequency sounds like that tiger rustling in the bush behind us, not mom's voice yelling at us. So
interesting.
then it looks like your child is ignoring you, right? You're yelling at them and it looks like they're ignoring you. Honestly, they're struggling to hear the words that you're saying when you're yelling because they're in fight or flight. And everything that comes out of our mouths either strengthens the connection with our child or weakens the connection with our child. And so yelling at our child is going to weaken that connection, right? You're going to destroy the relational equity and you're going to have repair work that you have to do. So we have to get curious. We have to be patient. We have to learn how to regulate our own emotions first so that we can help our child co regulate theirs. So it starts
Interesting.
with us lowering our volume of our voice, softening our facial expression, relaxing our body posture, removing excess noise and light in the environment. Right? We want to lower the temperature on the fire that's happening at the dining room table with our kids, so that then we can say something like, "Hey, I'm noticing that this seems really hard for you. I wonder what we could do to make it a little easier. Let's talk about some options." And so then you go into problem solving mode, right? You create this invitation for your child to safely say, yes, it is too hard. So then you're able to say, okay, well, yesterday you were able to master this concept. So let's go back to what we talked about yesterday, right? So return to that area where they could do it, right? Go back a step to where they were able to master it, and then start building slowly on this next concept that they're really struggling with, right? And then those are curricular decisions. But just involving the child in problem solving will go such a long way. But we also have to help our child name what they're feeling. Because what happens is when we are in this emotional fight or flight, that is the part of our brain that is the most active. But if we can name that emotion, it activates the language center of our brain, right? It pulls us out of our amygdala a little bit. Now,
Mm.
if you're in complete meltdown mode, you're face down in the carpet crying, that this is not going to work. So we have to use some other things. But yeah, like you've probably heard the phrase, you have to name it to tame it. And that's absolutely right. So that's an opportunity to really teach our child, hey, it seems like you're frustrated, and then relate to them, right? Yeah, I get frustrated when I can't do something that's hard too. And this is what I do.
From a parent perspective, what have you seen is the hardest part about raising children with ADHD, and like how do you help them as parents? Cuz like what you were talking about, like don't yell and all these things. Like those are very very hard to do, right? Every mom doesn't want to yell. Every mom would love to, be the peacemaker or like whatever. But there are just some moments where, you're trying to teach or you're trying to, cook and you're trying to do all these things, and like even you get to this point where you're just like, oh my gosh. And I imagine that like with a child that does not have ADHD, like that's one thing. But then with a child that does have ADHD, like the way that they are responding to you is really important. So there's almost this responsibility as a parent too, to make sure that you are being the way that they need you to be, in order for them to overcome their emotional responses and the things that are going on inside of them. Where do you help parents to even begin with that?
Yeah. So this is hard for a lot of parents because we have this tendency to parent the way we were parented.
Mm-hmm.
And just because you were parented that way and you feel like you turned out okay, um, doesn't mean that that's going to be successful with your child. So you need to parent your child, not the way you were parented necessarily. We used to not wear seatbelts in cars, right? But we've learned that it is safer to wear seatbelts now. And so just because we didn't wear seatbelts before and we turned out okay doesn't mean that's the safest way to do things. And so just because you think you turned out okay because you had a parent who yelled at you to make you behave, doesn't mean that that's going to work for your child or that that's the emotionally healthiest way to raise your child. So we have to look at ourselves and say, um, um, we're struggling with the way that we're parenting. And I like to go, well, how's that working for you? Right.
Mm.
Like I'll have a parent who says, well, they just need to listen. They need to do what I say because I'm the parent. And I say, well, how's that working for you? Like you wouldn't be standing in front of me asking for my help if everything was working. And so we have to say, we have to do it differently. And so that starts first within ourselves. We have to learn how to regulate our own emotions first. We cannot access grace when we're emotionally dysregulated. And so we have to be able to recognize when we are getting upset, when we are getting frustrated. We have to recognize when it's happening and we have to take a step back and say, you know what, I need a 10-minute break. So how about you take a break too? And so we need to learn breathing exercises, grounding exercises. We need to keep a frozen eye mask in our freezer so that we can put that on our eyes for 30 seconds and it'll lower the temperature on that fight or flight that we're starting to feel. We need to vibrate our own vagus nerve so that it activates our parasympathetic nervous system and regulates our own emotions. So emotions are contagious. We have these smart cells in our brains called mirror neurons. And the effect of a mirror neuron is strongest between people who have a close relationship. So that means my emotions as a mom are contagious to my child. The easiest way to illustrate that is when someone yawns and you yawn back, that's a mirror neuron kicking in. All right, so we have to regulate our own emotions, which helps co-regulate our child's emotions. So this starts with us. And then we have to adopt a mindset of curiosity, like I said before. We have to be able to say, hey, this isn't working. what should I do differently? Um, so that is the first step, right? Is learning to regulate our own emotions and recognizing, one of the things I do when I do ADHD presentations is I show images of the differences between an ADHD brain and a non ADHD brain because I want to build empathy. So when you can
Mm,
have empathy as a parent for your child's struggle, when you can recognize that there are real measurable differences in the brain. For example, there's less blood flow to the prefrontal cortex in an ADHD brain. So they're getting less oxygen in that area responsible for thinking, reasoning, planning, and execution. The connection between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex is disrupted. The brain volume is smaller in the ADHD brain. The electrical activity is different. We can see this on functional MRI, on quantitative EEG, on SPECT scans. And then there's a problem with dopamine and norepinephrine, the neurotransmitters that we think are responsible for the ADHD symptoms. And so we think there's one of three things happening. Either not enough dopamine can cross from one neuron to the other, can't cross that synaptic cleft, or we have enough dopamine, but the sending neuron is sucking it back up, or there's something wrong with the dopamine receptors on the receiving
mm,
neuron and it can't catch the dopamine. So there are chemical differences in the brain. So as parents, when we begin to understand that there are connectivity differences, oxygen differences, brain volume differences, and chemical differences in the brain, it begins to build empathy. Oh my gosh,
mm,
that is why my child is struggling. They aren't doing this to me,
mm-hmm,
right? They're struggling, and it's my job as a loving parent to help, right? And homeschooling parents already have a mindset of my child needs something different, or I want
mm-hmm,
something different for my child.
mm-hmm.
And so that's half the battle right there.
Yeah, this is fascinating to me. I wonder, so there's the one thing which is education, right? Like building the education that fits your kid's brain and the way that it works and that helps them to be able to pursue the things that they want. But then there's also just the question of like, okay, how about regular life and behavior? And so I want to take a step back really quickly and just chat really quickly about um behavior and regular life, right? Like it is very hard if you have not taught your kids the right skills to just like live in the world and be proper functioning humans and react to frustration and respond to these things, respond to stress. That is going to be actually the hardest part. And then once you add that into their education, like now they have the tools to then add on all these other topics. How do we as parents, especially with this podcast as homeschool families, how do we as parents help to set the right frameworks for our kids cognitively, right? Like how can we help parent, help bring in the right habits, help teach them the right concepts, like for example emotional words, like I am not just sad, angry, mad, like how can we develop their vocabulary even so that they know that they can be more than just that. What are the right like fundamentals to start with as a parent for creating this ability to then go on and build even more?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, first, we have to make sure that our children are getting restorative sleep because tired children cannot regulate their emotions. So, sleep deprivation reduces our capacity for regulating our emotion, it reduces dopamine sensitivity. It actually reduces our ability to recognize facial expressions accurately.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
And so, yes. And if we can't recognize a facial expression accurately, then we might have an inappropriate emotional response to a facial expression. We don't give enough credit to the role of sleep. And something amazing happens in the brain during sleep. So during the day, as we think and learn and walk and talk and live, we use up neurotransmitters and they leave behind uh, toxins. They leave behind a little, it's kind of like if you think of the brain as a big city and people are walking around and they leave trash everywhere, right? That is what's happening in our brains during the day. When we fall asleep, our brains shrink just a little bit to allow this, the glymphatic system with a G, the glymphatic system to release cerebrospinal fluid that literally washes our brain. Sleep is like putting our brain through a car wash. So it rinses all of that garbage, all of those toxins that are left behind during the day. Without that, those toxins begin to build up. You have toxins building up in your brain. How can your neurons communicate effectively? So also during sleep, it consolidates memories. So everything that we've learned during the day is consolidated during sleep. So that process can't happen either without sleep. So we have to recognize that it is so important to help our kids get restorative sleep. And it's easier said than done, especially with ADHD kids, right? Because
Yeah.
ADHD kids fall asleep later, don't stay asleep as long, and get up and get out of bed 1,000 times, right? And so it starts with saying, I'm going to make bedtime part of our day, right? It is almost like this is reading time, this is math time, this is outdoor activity time, this is bedtime. Because typically at the end of the day, we're exhausted and we can't wait for our kids to go to bed so we can have me time. And that makes us frustrated and emotionally dysregulated when our kid won't go to sleep. We just want them to go to sleep, right? So that we can then exhale. So if we start to think about bedtime as part of our day, part of our opportunity to connect with our child, continue to build relational equity, that means that we have to plan bedtime the same way we plan math and reading lessons. And so we have to say, does my child have sensory needs that aren't being met? Right. So most kids with ADHD have sensory processing issues. So they're either sensory seekers or sensory avoiders. So we've all seen that kid who's running laps around the living room and throwing themselves into the couch cushions at 8 p.m. That is a sensory seeker. That is a child who has not gotten enough sensory input from the environment during the day. So they are seeking additional input by throwing themselves into the couch cushions like that. And so that's a child who needs a swing in their bedroom, right? So bedtime stories are
Interesting.
in a swing where there's movement. That is a kid who you need to roll up in a blanket like a burrito and put a little bit of pressure therapy for them, right? That is a kid that would like a weighted blanket because that's proprioceptive input from the environment. And so if that child, that sensory seeker, isn't getting that, then they're not going to go to sleep, right? Sensory avoiders are the kids who can't stand the tag that's itching them in their pajamas. They're the ones who get dysregulated by an electric toothbrush, right? So they're the ones that need soft tagless pajamas, soft sheets, a bedroom that doesn't have a whole lot of stuff in it, right? Something that's soft. And so if their bedroom is full of toys and noise, then they're not going to go to sleep, right? And so again, we have to look at, are our child's sensory needs being met? To make sure that we have created an environment that's most conducive to sleep. Even the toothpaste flavor that we choose impacts their sensory needs, right? So sensory seekers are going to choose watermelon, right? Because it's this big, bold, bright flavor. And so then along with that, we really have to reduce screens because screens produce blue light. Blue light tells the brain it's daylight, inhibits melatonin release, that hormone that says, okay, body, it's time to go to sleep. And if our kids haven't gotten enough physical activity during the day, then they probably won't go to sleep well either. So, restorative sleep and recognizing all of those contributors to sleep deprivation, that is the number one thing as parents that we need to work on.
That is huge. You also mentioned quite a bit like curating an environment that suits your child's needs. How can you figure out? Because I would assume that most parents want to do that, right? Most parents
Mhm.
want to make sure that they've curated the environment that's proper to their kids. But I think you made a good point earlier whenever you said we do what worked for us most of the time just because it worked. Like we turned out good, we turned out fine.
Right.
And so, where do you even begin with understanding what like to the even minute detail of like adding swing to the bedroom, or like the toothbrush sound, or like the flavor of your toothpaste, like all of those tiny things. Is there a way that families can find maybe a resource for that, or where do they even start looking to understand how, number one, do I need to curate my environment for my kid even if I want to, and number two, what are the most important things to start with first?
Yeah. So if your child has ADHD, I guarantee you already know these patterns, right? You know that they're constantly seeking activity and it gets worse in the evenings. And so that probably means that your child is a sensory seeker. You know, if your child can't stand itchy fabrics or makes you cut the tag out of absolutely everything, they can't wear anything wool because it itches so badly, right? You know, right, just from the patterns of behavior, what's happening. So, a great resource is the Homeschool OT. So, she has a podcast, she has a website, and so that's Sarah Collins. And occupational therapists are the experts on those sensory issues. So start with her website, start with her podcast, because she talks a lot about sensory seekers and sensory avoiders. But there are other easily Googleable resources. Uh, Bedtime ideas for sensory seekers, bedtime ideas for sensory avoiders. And so it's all over the internet, very easy to access. And
That's
it'll give you
amazing.
checklists of, hey, how do I know if my child's a sensory seeker or sensory avoider? And I think there's a physical therapist that I interviewed on my podcast. I think Dr. Sensory is her uh, website. So she had some great ideas too.
I love this also perspective on, and I think like the fact that there are kids and there are students that like need something different in order to thrive. Like that is bringing a lot of attention to this fact that like no child is the same, right? And no child needs the same thing. And like in the perfect world, we could curate, right, every experience, every environment to fit the child in front of us. But I think it's really, really cool how, you know, this world of ADHD allows families to dive into that a little bit more in a way that that is you know, very specific to that individual child. Like there are some things that might work for my child, there are some things that might work for your child that like literally do not work, and they might be the exact same type of ADHD, or they might have a lot of similar things that they care about, but they'll never be the exact same. And I feel like that is very, very cool to see. What are some of the like superpowers that come along with ADHD? You mentioned that most students with ADHD are wildly curious, and I would love to hear a little bit of the pros, because I feel like with ADHD there's a lot of this like negative. You know, you think about the cost of it, the fact that it's hard, the fact that you can't figure anything out, or like it's tiring, as an example. What are the possible benefits of a kid having ADHD, and how can you as a parent also help them to lean into those?
Yeah. So I love that you rephrased superpower to benefit, because I actually don't like that social media trend of
Interesting.
calling ADHD a superpower. And here's why. What I think that does is it um, minimizes the struggle. It says, hey, this is your diagnosis, and that's a superpower, and you need to own that as your superpower. When this is a child who is struggling to regulate their emotions, is probably struggling to learn, is struggling to behave in a way that's socially acceptable, right? Is really struggling with that sensory input or lack of sensory input. There's a struggle, and so to call it a superpower is minimizing the struggle.
I love that.
So, what I like to suggest is that we find those things that our child can do really well, that we find what they're passionate about, what they've mastered, what they want to master. Those are their superpowers, right? Having ADHD is not a superpower. So, Dr. Robert Brooks is a neuropsychologist who says that kids with ADHD swim in oceans of inadequacy. So they constantly feel inadequate and less than. And so we have to identify their islands of competence in that big ocean of inadequacy. And those islands of competence are those things that they love and do really well. And when we nurture those things that they love and do really well, that builds resilience to the struggles. Because the reality is that
Interesting.
struggle is going to exist, that diagnosis exists. And so if you think of it as existing in this bucket, right? Our job as parents is to make that bucket as big as possible so that that struggle seems small in comparison to the resilience that we've built in a really big bucket, right? Of islands of competence and things that they do well. And so let me just give you an example. So two of my children have an ADHD diagnosis. And so my youngest in fifth grade could not even spell his own name. He had low self esteem. He was bullied all the time. He felt horrible about himself. And so, what we had to do is say, our child needs something that he does well. And
Hmm.
so, we said, what does that look like? And we found three things that he became passionate about and could master. And that was movement. So, he became a competitive rock climber. Music, he became an elite musician, played in the city's youth symphony, and he's a music performance major in college now. He plays the flute and piccolo. And ministry. He just loved um, evangelizing. And oddly, his name is Evan. So once we were able to find things that he was passionate about, then we were able to nurture those things, right? We gave him every opportunity that we could to nurture that. We worked on that struggle as well, right? So we put him through cognitive training and a reading remediation program at LearningRx so that he went from not being able to spell his own name in fifth grade to being in gifted and talented language arts by
Wow.
seventh grade. And then we sent him to college as a high schooler.
Wow.
So we decided to homeschool him as a high schooler, and we sent him to community college for most of his credits, and then gave him credit for rock climbing as a PE credit and music, performance as a
Hmm.
music, right? And so we were able to curate opportunities for him to earn high school credit by nurturing those things that he did well. And he got an A in English 101 and 102 at the community college as a ninth grader.
Wow.
Couldn't spell his own name as a fifth grader, right? So we had to make his bucket so big that it built resilience to that ADHD diagnosis.
That is very interesting and so cool that you were able to say, okay, what does my kid need and how can I give that to him? Um, so something that I also find interesting is that you actually worked on the struggle. So it wasn't just like, okay, he's struggling here. Maybe it's like that's an issue for later. Like I'm just going to focus on something that he can win at, and then we'll focus on that later. It like I think there's this question between um, how much do they actually need to know, right? So, like if for example a kid is struggling in math, is it the curriculum's fault? Is it the fact that they're just not understanding it? Is it a teacher? And trying to problem solve through that is very difficult, but I think I love the fact that you said this is something that he really needs. Like we have determined that this is something that he needs to get through. And I've chatted with our VP of learning, and she says so she has an ADHD diagnosis, and she says that her mom actually made her master the things that were really difficult for her so that she knew that she could. And that has been something that was very important for her growing up over time. Is like she had this huge struggle with ADHD, with like trying to get through certain different topics, but her mom being able to say, let's get you the help that you need, let's make this a priority, and let's show you that you can master something even if it is very difficult to you. That has been something that has like carried throughout her adult life. And I love the fact that you didn't just say, okay, like he's just not going to be good at that and that's it. It was, let's solve this problem together. Like, let's find the ways that he can actually overcome this, and become very, very knowledgeable at it. Why was that your initial reaction? Like, and how can more families like figure out the right things for them to do in order to solve those struggles? Like, not necessarily say, okay, this is like not something we're even going to deal with or talk about or touch. Like, we're actually going to overcome this instead.
Yeah, I love that question because we have this tendency, and the public school system has this tendency to accommodate
Hmm.
ADHD struggles, right? Well, let's just put them in the front of the class so we can make sure that they aren't distracted by the other kids. Let's give them extra time on assignments. By the way, extra time on assignments lowers motivation. So
Interesting.
it's a terrible accommodation. So why accommodate when we can remediate, right? That is
Mm,
my mindset. And as a cognitive psychologist, I understand that the brain is malleable, right? We are not stuck with the cognitive cards we've been dealt. We can remediate weak cognitive skills. I did this study in 2019 on more than 5,000 children and adults with ADHD. And what I did is I worked with a clinical neuroscientist on this study. We've published it. We created cognitive profiles across the lifespan of ADHD. We gave them standardized IQ tests and we plotted the trajectory of the subtests, right? So we looked at attention and reasoning and processing speed and working memory, long term memory, visual and auditory processing. And we plotted them on a graph. And what we found was that attention was not the weakest cognitive skill in ADHD across the lifespan.
interesting.
So let me say that again. Attention was not the weakest cognitive skill. Working memory, long term memory, and processing speed all fell below the 38th percentile in more than 5,000 children and adults with ADHD. And so we have this tendency to go, oh, my kid has ADHD. Let me fix his attention and focus, when attention and focus was not the real issue. Attention and focus, that was average. So we're missing the
Interesting.
boat on what we should do for an intervention if we don't address working memory, long-term memory, and processing speed. Do you know that we need strong working memory and processing speed for emotion regulation, not just learning? Like when we are frustrated and stressed and emotionally dysregulated, we have to have strong working memory in order to hold all of the alternatives in mind, hold all of the explanations in mind, and hold all of the potential options in mind. And we have to have strong processing speed in order to access those quickly and act on them quickly. Otherwise, we stay dysregulated. So we don't even think about needing memory and processing speed for emotion dysregulation, which is the biggest, hardest symptom in about 80% of kids with ADHD, right? So not only do we need it for thinking and learning, but we need it for emotions as well and behavior. So we have to choose an intervention that is going to strengthen all of those cognitive skills. We
Interesting.
did a similar study and found in children with dyslexia, working memory, long term memory, and processing speed were also weak cognitive skills. So,
Mm,
and we need all of those skills to read fluently, to have strong reading comprehension. So, how could I not address that as a
hmm.
cognitive psychologist? Like, how could I not? And so, if your child has been diagnosed by a clinical psychologist or neuropsychologist, then you have that report. You should have a neuropsych testing report that shows you the subtest scores. If not, you can go to a Learning RX center and we do cognitive testing because that's how we determine if that's what the struggle is.
Interesting. So, when you decided to help your son work through the struggle, how did you decide on the intervention that you were going to put in place? How did you decide on the next steps for him and then get him to the place where now he is obviously thriving in the things that he used to struggle in?
Yeah, well, that's an easy one because I'm the psychology and research director for Learning RX globally, and so I knew that's exactly what he needed. That he needed those cognitive skills strengthened, and he needed reading remediation, right? Because in fifth grade, we should be able to spell our own name,
Yes.
right? And so, um, you know what I was seeing was that struggle in reading was causing behavioral issues as well. In the very top of this episode, we talked about why is my kid not able to focus and pay attention because he's stressed and frustrated that he can't do it. So it was a no-brainer for me, like to say, okay, let's remediate these cognitive skills. And
So then what were you doing? What were the different things that he was doing, to work through this? Was it sounds like it was not just reading help, right? And that's not
Right.
even at all what it was. You did things to help him learn to read more, but like it's all of these extra things
Yeah.
that actually are the supportive mechanisms for him being able to read.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm so sorry that my nose is
Oh,
running
you're
today.
good.
Anyway, okay. So cognitive training is that targeted, repeated, intense mental tasks that work on that idea of neuroplasticity, that the brain is capable of change. It's a beautiful phenomenon. And so we have over 1,000 different ways, 1,000 different hands-on activities, mental tasks that we can use to strengthen those cognitive skills that are weak, to remediate those skills that are weak. And we pace almost every one of those tasks with a metronome to increase intensity, and intensity is what drives neuroplasticity, and to create automaticity, to make these tasks automatic. And so it skills that work on building processing speed and memory and attention and reasoning and visual and auditory processing. And so yes, we need to work on auditory processing skills, phonological and phonemic awareness, phonics, comprehension, fluent, but we also need to remediate all of those supporting skills when it comes to weaknesses in reading. So that's what we did. He did 36 weeks of intense cognitive training. Typically, kids with reading struggles only need about 24 weeks. Kids who don't have reading struggles that just have cognitive weaknesses might just need a 12-week intensive program. The cool part is we did a study during COVID where we compared delivering cognitive training in person to delivering cognitive training over Zoom. And we found that there were no statistically significant differences in the outcomes. And
Wow.
so that's the beautiful part of it, that you can live anywhere in the world, that we can come right into your dining room table through Zoom. And so we have a whole homeschool program, right, where we support homeschooling families by coming right into your dining room over Zoom um, to deliver cognitive training and reading remediation when it's needed without disrupting your homeschool day.
Do you recommend that most families do like the supportive things, and then where there are specific issues, that's where they like add in, so the remedial reading training, if there was any sort of like math things that they were struggling with or whatever, like that's how you would normally do it, is okay, you take that test that you got that shows where your children are, you know, maybe tracking lower than normal or average, and then that's where you kind of help them to come to either average or above average, hopefully.
Yeah, so it really depends on yes, the test results, but also what you're seeing as a homeschooling parent.
Lovely.
And we're going to see something different in a 7-year-old than a 17-year-old. And so, I like to say that reading struggles are typically caused from the brain, not the books. Because what happens with homeschooling families is we get frustrated and we say, well, this curriculum must not be good enough. This curriculum isn't working. And so you change
Mhm.
curriculum 2, 3, 4 times when really it's what's happening in the brain that needs to change. And then any curriculum should be successful, right? As long as it's a structured literacy program, science of reading based program, any of those reading curriculums should be okay if we remediate the underlying weak cognitive skills. So in a 7-year-old, that may be all that we need to do, right? Is remediate those cognitive skills, do some early reading training, and then they're good to go. A 17-year-old who has struggled with weak cognitive skills their entire schooling, they've missed a lot of critical instruction, right? Because they just couldn't get it. And so they may need additional work on content by the
Mm,
homeschooling parent after their cognitive skills have been remediated because they've missed so much, right? So we're not teaching calculus, right? We're
mm.
remediating those basic skills and those underlying learning skills.
And my last question for you, how do you get your kid to buy in? So,
Mm.
like, you know, in all of these things, they're required to show up, and Maria Montessori loved to say that, like, as teachers, the student has to accept what we're teaching them. Otherwise, they're not going to learn. And so in this especially, right, where I assume that most of these kids that have been struggling with ADHD for, even a short while or especially a long while, like there is sort of this like pushback against learning in general just because they've had so many struggles with it. How do you
Yep.
get them to the point where they're ready to buy in?
Yeah. It's a great question. So it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, about involving your child in problem solving. And
Mm,
so by creating this invitation, and saying, look, I've noticed that you're really struggling at whatever it is, right? I've noticed that you're getting frustrated, that it's really hard. Um, I have an idea. I wonder if you would consider trying it.
mm,
And then that's all you have to do. I wonder if you would consider trying it. And then we come in, right? They get their appointment with their one on one cognitive trainer, right? Who has mastered the ability to motivate, to keep a child engaged, to give them high fives and verbal feedback, and understands how to read frustration levels and pull back a little bit, let them experience some success and then push forward, right? That appointment is their very own, right? And they're going to experience success, which is going to breed more success, which is going to build confidence and self esteem for learning, self efficacy for learning. And so, as a parent, we just have to create the invitation, right? Would you be willing to try this and see? And so, I rarely see a child say, no, I don't want to try, right? Or I won't agree to try, right? Just do one lesson and just see. Because we'll do a sample training session, right? Just so a child can see they're intense mental exercises, but they're game like, they're fun, hard, but fun. And so our trainers are engaging and, um,
that's so cool.
yeah, yeah. So would you be willing to try, right? You create an invitation.
Okay. I would love to ask you questions for the next hour or two or three. But I do know that you host your own podcast and that people can find you as well in lots of places. So, where can people find you if they would like more and to learn more?
Yeah. So my podcast is called The Brainy Moms. So we're on anywhere podcasts play, social media at The Brainy Moms and thebrainymoms.com. My personal website is amymorephd.com. And so you can go there and watch videos of other presentations that I've done. And if you want more information about cognitive training, you can go to learningrx.com/homeschool. And on the homeschool page is an opportunity to sign up for lots of free stuff, right? So sign up. You get some free cognitive training exercises that you can try. Homeschool parents are DIYers, so you can try those at home. There's a discount on an assessment. Lots of cool stuff. learningrx.com/homeschool.
This has been so amazing. And thank you so much. You're a wealth of knowledge.
Thank you for having me today.